Verse 234. Like figures in Maya, people are born and die. In the same way the ignorant, because of their stupidity, imagine there really is bondage and release. So, like figures in Maya. The simile here is not very obvious. But Maya is often described as being like a magical illusion, whereby you see something that isn't there. Maybe you mistake a piece of wood for an elephant. This is the power of the illusionist. So people are born and die. It's like a suggestion. That elephant never really came into being. So the implication here is that individuals never really came into being either. Again, I would go back to the analogy with dreams. How many people did you interact with in your dreams last night? What would it mean if somebody was born in a dream, or if somebody died in your dream? The joy or the grief might be just as intense, but nothing really happened. And it seems a bit much to dismiss birth and death in this way. Death is the one thing that gives us all pause for thought. But that's usually as far as it goes. A certain person is no longer going to be around. They leave a hole somehow, they leave a gap. It's very difficult to come to terms with this. In fact, it's not possible to come to terms with death. So we might grieve, and then we move on. We have to move on. The option of carrying on grieving is a rather dismal one. In the series of videos on the Yoga Vasishtha, which is full of stories, many of these stories take place in times of trauma, of warfare, in times of bereavement. So a death actually gives us an opportunity to look into this teaching very fully. We might start looking into it from a spiritual understanding. We might then think in terms of what comes next after death in the traditional Indian context. It's assumed that you carry on in some form or another. You're reborn again, you go through another life, you die, you're reborn again, you go through another life, you die. So the point is to get out of this endless cycle. Most of the Indian teachings from different traditions assume this. They only differ in how you might get out of it. But what this verse is telling us is that this way of thinking is the result of the stupidity of the ignorant. To think in terms of bondage and release is as much delusion as birth and death. So this is actually quite shocking. It might not seem so shocking to a Westerner, but if you come from this tradition which assumes this particular framework in the West, the general assumption seems to be that you come into being at some point, you die, and that's it. You know, if you're not religious. But in India, it didn't matter whether you're Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, or whatever. There's this idea that things carry on and carry on repeating. That's samsara. How do you get out of it? How do you get from the bondage of samsara to the liberation of nirvana? This verse is telling us such a way of thinking is ignorant. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion here which I might retract later on. I don't think this verse is saying that there's no such thing as enlightenment, no such thing as awakening. Because you can awaken from delusion. You can see through the illusion. And that's what the next verse is about. Seeing through the illusion. But you cannot do it from within delusion. You cannot follow a path from delusion to enlightenment, from ignorance to enlightenment. And I think this is the implication of this verse. If you assume that there's bondage and you assume that there's liberation, then the assumption follows that there's some sort of path. There's certain things that you should do, certain practices that you should follow. That will take you from bondage to liberation. And this isn't part of the Mahayana teaching. You awaken. You awaken from the dream, and you realize the nature of everything as dream. There is no path to awakening. Any more than there's a certain procedure you have to go through before you wake up from your sleep. It's something that happens. There is nothing that you can do. You simply awaken. But there's still this feeling that surely there's something we can do. And there is. There is. We examine the dream. We examine our assumptions about reality, about the reality of the dream. And this is very difficult to do because we're not usually aware of our assumptions. Our assumptions are our innate prejudices. There are things we wouldn't even think of questioning. But that's what we're doing in these videos. We are questioning assumptions which we wouldn't even think of questioning. And we'll continue with this in the next video.